Dave's going to come up here and share with us. Dave, obviously you guys know, most of you know him. Dave's been a friend of the church for a long, long time. They ended up moving out another place. We moved out here, kind of cut off some fellowship, but almost every Thursday morning that Dave is in town, we have breakfast together with a group of guys. And when he's not in town, for the most part, he's got some administrative and political, really, things to do from time to time. But he spends a lot of time in environments that, and helping to shape environments that without guidance and without the resources could be a very hopeless situation. And so he'll tell you a little bit about that probably. And he's got this new beautiful book that can be pre-ordered on Amazon. And when I looked at it, the price was what it says. You're certainly not trying to get rich off this book. Okay. All right. Well, that's a pretty good deal. That's a pretty good deal. So anyway, he'll explain all that stuff to you. Dave Stevens, come on up. And thank you so much. And then Mike will be here for questions when they're appropriate.
Please feel free to ask questions anywhere along the way. But I do have a question, Ronnie, for you first, since you're going to be asking some of me, I'm sure. But did I understand, Larry, correctly that you were fleecing somebody? He said something about you and fleecing related to the coats, so I thought I better clarify that. Yeah, attempt, yes. Well, related to what Larry was saying in terms of where I spend some of my time, and not very well, right? When my kids were young and at home, when we'd meet new people, they would always say, well, first, our dad was in the state hospital, then he went to prison, and then he was in jail. And so I had to clarify, working, not residing. And so I do spend a lot of time consulting in jails and prisons around the country and speaking of places where there's no hope. That really that's part of the great darkness in those facilities is the oppressive lack of hope. And we're seeing that, I think, more and more in our society. With the election coming up, there's some hope, but there's also a lot of fear and lack of hope about the possibilities of what could happen. And so I'm really delighted to be here, to have the opportunity to talk about, very briefly, to talk about the book, but more importantly, to talk about hope in a bigger picture and a bigger context. So the title of the book is Restored Hope, a Neuroscience Guide to Optimal Brain and Human Function. And so really this talk is about the book, meaning the Bible, and not the book, meaning Restored Hope. But just a couple of comments to go back for a second. So a couple of words about the book. This is something, and just to be clear, like I said, the topic of tonight is the book. But this book, in a different way, but was inspired by God. And the content is inspired by him. And the things he's been showing me and teaching me over the last 7 years. And one of the things that he did as part of this is the picture on the front, that cloud was, he told me, that's how I look, and that's what I want on the cover of the book. So that is there to represent him. And I obviously didn't put on there God and a little arrow, but I think he will communicate that message to people. And that's certainly the ultimate source of hope, is him and our relationship with him. So just a couple of quick facts about that, and I can actually now go in the right direction. So really, the book is about, like it says there, the gospel in neuroscience language. And so we will be talking tonight primarily in neuroscience language, in some technical language, but hopefully that is understandable. And anybody please feel free to come and ask questions as we go along if something isn't clear or you want more information. But again, this is the gospel. And as you can see there, so the first thing I'm going to do is define hope. The dehumanization and rehumanization is a way to label the gospel message. We know that at the time of the fall, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute, but we know that at the time of the fall, dehumanization happened. Death happened. And through Jesus, rehumanization happened. And so, again, technical, more scientific, philosophical language, but the message of the gospel, and then I'll close with talking about hope realized. So, in the Bible, not every instance, but most of the references that include that we translate hope, the Greek word is elpida or elpisa. And the definition of that word is not a possibility, not that we think maybe a good thing could happen, maybe there will be positives, maybe in words that I'll talk, or in a word that I'll talk much more about, but in terms of being restored, hope does not mean maybe. Hope means a certainty. And as you can see there, a certain expectation and an event not which maybe could happen, not which, if we're like looking for the great pumpkin and are more earnest than anybody else, it will happen, but certainty, no doubt, no question, certain expectation. And that's what we mean when we talk about hope. And God isn't giving us conditional promises. He isn't saying could happen, might happen. He's saying will happen. And that's the foundation of hope, is, again, the certainty. So dehumanization began in the garden at the time of the fall. And as you can see there, the Bible is really a story of how dehumanization began and the effects of dehumanization on every single human that's ever lived. And also rehumanization, which we'll talk about later, but we're going to begin at the beginning, talking about the story from Genesis 3 and how dehumanization started. So it began, and I deliberately, it wasn't a typo, I deliberately put Satan there with a small s, because that's how it's written in the Greek in the Bible. The word Satan is not capitalized, and it means the accuser. And we'll talk about how our brains can function as accusers, and how Satan began at the beginning accusing, saying to Adam and Eve, "You're deficient. There's really some knowledge you could have that you don't have, and you'd be far better if you had that knowledge." And so he was already accusing, laying the groundwork or the foundation for dehumanization. That very statement was dehumanizing, because God had created humans, Adam and Eve in this case, perfect, whole, complete. And so Satan began working to undermine that in Genesis 3, verse 1. And so what Adam and Eve did was they ate of the tree, and as you can see, I put up there the knowledge of function and dysfunction. Some of you might find interesting, there's a guy named Jeffrey Benner who does what he calls the mechanical Hebrew translation. And so he translates literally word for word with the exact word, including the meaning it had in that culture. And so you can look him up online. Again, it's Jeffrey Benner. You can look under the mechanical translation, and find it there. But the literal words talking about the tree of the knowledge, what I for sure had always heard of, the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, the actual Hebrew words are the knowledge of the tree of function and dysfunction, which is very different than good and evil, and a more accurate translation. And that's really kind of what Satan was presenting to Adam and Eve. You're not functional. You need more information. And so when they ate of the tree, then dysfunction was introduced to humanity. And there was immediate brain effects, which I'll talk about in a second, but then progressive dehumanization. So what happened when they first took a bite of the apple, which we always say, which who knows if it was an apple or not, but when they first took that bite, Adam and Eve immediately saw the possibility of dysfunction. And that was enough in neuroscience terms to activate their sympathetic nervous system, their fight or flight or freeze system. When that happened, what happened immediately was the fuel to their brain, which I'll talk more about too, but the fuel to their brain, which is glucose, became limited. And that is literally when death entered the human race. Because with that very first sympathetic nervous system activation, the brain lost a little bit of fuel and then became vulnerable to continuing to lose fuel, which eventually culminated in system and organ and tissue decline and dysfunction. And eventually, when the brain loses enough fuel, as we get old enough, it no longer can regulate the body or itself anymore, and you begin to have system breakdown and death. And the word in Genesis, the word for you shall surely die, or in Hebrew it's technically dying, you shall die. That word is not talking about what we talk about as spiritual death. That is literally physical death. And that was the entry point into the universe, into the human race of physical death. And then that progressed, and as we'll talk about here in a second, was passed down. So the dehumanization, the loss of function, and at the same time as there was the loss of fuel to the brain, of function to the brain and the body, immediately along with that came the interpretation of deficit, of incompleteness, of unworthiness. And any time and every time the brain loses fuel, the interpretation of there's something fundamentally, intrinsically wrong with me increases. So it's kind of a funny way to say it, but we begin to dehumanize ourselves. We begin to think, I'm broken, I'm incomplete, I'm unwhole, as it progresses, I'm worthless, I'm a failure. And so, right at the time of the fall, and Satan, in my belief, knew it would happen, that activate the sympathetic nervous system, decline begins, death begins, and in his view, I think he won at that point. I am undermining humanity beginning at this point in time with the ingestion of that apple and the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. From now on, forever, every single person will doubt themselves. They will doubt God, because how could God really, fully, truly love me if I'm defective, if I'm deficient, if there's something wrong with me? So then I have to depend on myself. I can't trust God anymore, because clearly he didn't prevent me from becoming defective. So I become idolatrous, thinking I'm on my own. I've got to take care of myself. I have to protect myself. And maybe I'll acknowledge you verbally, God. Maybe I'll think about trusting you, but really, probably I can't fully. And again, that's idolatry, thinking I'm above God. I can take care of myself better than he can. And all of that began with doing what God said, and God kept his promise that if you do this, you will die. And we'll talk toward the end about some more of the implications of that. But that's what happened. That's what's happened to everyone. And you can't have hope when you think you're defective, when you think you're irrevocably broken, when you think you're worthless. There's no possibility for complete hope at that point, right?
So a question came to mind, and it helps me to think in terms of contrast. Mm-hmm. So the sympathetic nervous system was misused through the fall, mm-hmm. and it led to false conclusions. How would you characterize, or have you thought about how you would characterize the created function of the sympathetic nervous system? What did God make that system to be for and to do and to produce?
Yeah, great question. And so that was part of his plan. And here we kind of wade into some trickier theological waters about knowledge and predestination and those kinds of things. But in my view, God knew that Adam and Eve would make that choice to eat of the fruit. And he knew the result of that. And so he designed us with safety nets in place. And the sympathetic nervous system is really a safety net. So the brain's most important function is to protect us and keep us alive. And so when we're in danger, or even when we interpret that we're in danger, that activates the sympathetic nervous system. So the brain gets more glucose in that moment than it does normally. And I won't go into all the technical details of that. If somebody wants to know, you can come ask the question, but I won't inflict that upon you. But when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, more glucose, all the glucose possible, comes rushing into the brain. And I should have said already, glucose is the fuel for our brains, and it's the primary fuel for our brains and for our bodies. And so we must have glucose to function. So when the fight or flight / sympathetic system is activated, more glucose, all the possible glucose, comes into the brain, so you can fight if you need to, so you can flee if you need to, so you can protect yourself. And so God designed that system with that possibility in mind. In my view, and there's no proof of this, but there wasn't fear before the fall. There wasn't danger or evidence of danger before the fall. So it wasn't necessary until that act of eating of the tree happened. And so God instituted that as a protective mechanism. And then he further instituted that would only last for about 20 minutes, because if that sympathetic nervous system is activated for longer than that, then your brain could drain your body of glucose, and that would kill you. And then he also designed the brain to be adaptable and flexible. So as it loses fuel, it can make decisions about what function needs the most fuel in the moment, and then it will allocate fuel there, again, as a protective mechanism. So part of the genius, and it's really not giving God full credit to call it genius, he's beyond that. But the genius of the system is these built-in safety mechanisms. So does that answer the question, Larry? So we've been talking about dehumanization became literally universal at the time of the fall. And then interestingly, the glucose limitation from the sympathetic nervous system activation happens in the intrauterine developmental process. And I was kind of thinking as I wrote that, you probably weren't expecting at a Joyland service to hear the phrase, the intrauterine developmental process. But kind of important. So there's been a lot of research that indicates that the primary, not the only, but the primary reason there are developmental deficits or developmental delays at the time of birth is that the mother doesn't have enough glucose. And so Eve did not have enough glucose for Cain and Abel and whatever other children she may or may not have had. So then Cain and Abel's wives didn't have enough glucose for their children. So you can see that the effect of sin was passed on neurochemically. It was passed on genetically in the sense of if the mother doesn't have enough glucose, she can't provide enough glucose to the fetus. So the fetus is already born with some amount of glucose limitation, lack of full function, and the corresponding interpretation, even pre-verbally, of something's wrong with me. And if somebody doesn't support that baby's head adequately, if the baby rolls off the changing table, if the baby or the young child trips and falls down the stairs, that just continues to and increases the glucose limitation, which increases the perception of deficit, unworthiness, inadequacy, lack of acceptance, and dehumanization.
I know Dr. Dave because I call him Dr. Dave. I went through a process to try to help me with a head injury, but I now know more about this than maybe many people here.
Yeah.
Would you say that a lack of glucose not only affects your physical capability, but also affects your mental capability?
Yes. It affects every single human function. So I'll do my best not to wander too far into the weeds telling case stories, but related to this question. So I was working with a guy, excuse me, several years ago, and he began having migraine headaches every single day of his life at age 9. And when I met him, he was in his 60s, and he'd had a migraine every single day beginning at age 9. And so we were able to eliminate those migraines. But one day he said to me, I think you're going to find this interesting. He said, I had this split in my thumbnail that was there for years and years and years. And I occasionally would ask doctors about it, and they'd tell me, yeah, we don't know what it is, but it's not hurting anything, so don't worry about it. He said, I just realized last week that split in my thumbnail's gone. So I talk about with people, and it's a little beyond the scope of this particular talk, but talk about how the brain controls the body. And we don't really think about the extent to which that's true, but the brain controls every single part of the body, which includes itself, which includes cognition, memory, attention, which includes every single human function. Pardon? Reasoning, judgment, planning, analysis, every single function. Yep, predictions, all of it. So, like I said, this dehumanization coming from the neurochemical shortage of glucose to the brain is universal and is transmitted via the mother to the fetus. Yes? He did. Yeah, yeah. He had not, last time I talked to him, and he calls me every now and then, but I think it had been 3 years since he'd had a migraine. So the outcomes of dehumanization, and we certainly don't have time to go into all the details, and there's some intermediate steps. So if I jump too far and the transition isn't clear, please feel free to ask. But so the outcomes are what I call the existential fears, which is the fear of worthlessness, and the fear of death. And those two things are universal, and they come directly from the limitation of glucose. And I think I said it, but just to say it again, that every single time the sympathetic nervous system is activated, we lose a little more glucose or fuel to our brain, which results in a little bit lower function. And a lot of times we don't notice that slow incremental change, but over time, and it can be, I don't even know what happened, but all of a sudden, I can't remember anything. Or I never used to have headaches, and all of a sudden I do now. Or I was always a pretty calm person, and now I'm anxious. Usually it's incremental, or even if it comes on the heels of, which I guess biologically is impossible. I was going to say if it came on the heels of a head injury, but if it comes right after a head injury, a lot of times people still don't make that connection. That, well, he was doing just fine, and then all of a sudden, he couldn't pay attention in school anymore, and he was getting in trouble, and he was yelling at us, and he started drinking. And then with a little investigation and questioning, very often it was, well, now that you mention it, he did fall off his bike and lost consciousness for a few minutes. Amazingly, right before all these symptoms appeared. So every loss of glucose, which happens with every sympathetic nervous system activation, results in a little bit more, a little decrease in function, let me say it that way, and an increase in dehumanization, and an increase in thoughts of something's wrong with me. I'm not good enough. I'm broken. I'm defective. I'm unacceptable. That happens every time. And it really could happen with something as simple as earlier, part of this microphone, the clip came off, and Ronnie and I were rummaging around looking for it. Well, if it had happened to fall under one of these tables, and had I reached down to grab it and then stood back up and hit my head, often something that minor can activate the sympathetic nervous system and result in a glucose limitation. So it doesn't take a lot for that to happen, and it continues to happen progressively until you address it with getting the brain refueled. But so the existential fears, again, fear of worthlessness, fear of death. Then dehumanizing others, acting like there's something wrong with you, acting like you're not good enough for me to interact with you, acting like you did something wrong, and so I'm pulling back because you did something wrong, or you're not good enough, or you don't matter. We dehumanize others to protect ourselves. And so if I can criticize somebody else, even mentally, don't have to say anything, but if I can put them down a little bit, then I feel a little better, and there's a little easing of my perception of worthlessness, of my dehumanizing myself. So if we're kind of faced with the choice of, am I going to dehumanize myself or somebody else, then I choose them. I need to protect myself to make sure I don't feel as worthless. And really, in my view, what we're doing is we're defacing God's image bearers. We'll talk about it a little bit more in a minute, but we bear the image of God. I think everybody knows that. And so every person is a direct bearer of his image. And one of the ways I think about it is God deliberately, specifically, intentionally created each one of us to be exactly who we are in every detail. Our appearance, our function, our physiology, our brains, our interests, our talents, all of that God created, again, very specifically, very deliberately, because he wanted each of us to be exactly who we are. And that is what gives us our infinite worth. Because we are unique, no one else in the history of the universe, nothing else in the history of the universe is exactly us. So in that way, we can reflect his glory in a way that nothing else in the universe can. So we are very specifically bearing a specific aspect of his image, as well as the general characteristics of his image. So no injury, no behavior, nothing can cause us to be defective, can reduce us in any way, can minimize us in any way, but it can deface us, meaning obscure his image. So if you're familiar with the term, you know, like if somebody spray paints or tags a building, that's considered defacing. If you write on government property, that's considered defacing. And it is, again, just obscuring. That doesn't change the building. It doesn't change the document. It doesn't change anything other than its appearance. And so, so important for you to know that nothing you do, nothing that anyone does to you, nothing that happens diminishes you in any way at all. It may reduce your function in the moment, but it does not diminish you. But we can deface ourselves, meaning we can obscure God's image, and things other people do can appear to deface us, but it has no permanent effect. And then the last dehumanization outcome, whoa. Maybe I'll just put it in my pocket. The last dehumanization outcome is, and I put death in quotes. The reason I put death in quotes is because no one ever dies. And this will be relevant at the very end, but yeah. I did study well in comedy school, Ronnie. We pass from this dimension to the other dimension, what we call heaven. And heaven really is just, the definition of heaven is the place where God is. And God is not, for the most part, visibly present in this dimension. But again, there's never a single millisecond when we're not alive. We're in this dimension or we're in that dimension, and it's an immediate, we think, an immediate transformation. So there's no basis for the fear of death because we're never going to die. We're never going to cease to exist. We will either be here on this earth or in heaven with God. And, you know, there's certainly within the theological tradition the thought that some people will be in hell. I wonder about that, and I think Larry wonders about that, and others do as well. But we're still alive continuously. So before we go to rehumanization, any questions about dehumanization, what happened at the fall, what's happening neurochemically? Any questions about any of that, except for Ronnie? No.
There is something, maybe you could explain it or reiterate it somehow, but the fact that each time something happens is traumatic, it causes less and less glucose to come to the brain.
True.
Can you explain why that's the case?
Sure.
Thank you.
Would you like me to, or did you just want to know if I could? Yes. So the question is, I think probably everybody heard, but just to make sure I understood correctly, why is it that there's progressive glucose limitation each time? Yeah. So an interesting thing, at least to me and hopefully to you, but I have wondered for a while, and by a while I mean like almost exactly 7 years, what was the thing that limited glucose to the brain? So with the sympathetic nervous system activation, there is what's called the blood-brain barrier. So it keeps glucose just from getting to the brain without any filter. And it prevents bacteria, foreign agents, dangerous things from getting into the brain. So that blood-brain barrier is composed of cells within the capillaries within the brain called pericytes, Pericytes. Those pericytes make the blood-brain barrier more or less permeable. In other words, harder or easier for glucose to get from the blood to the brain. And so when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, the brain needs all the glucose it can get, all the fuel it can get to protect you. And so that the pericytes make the blood-brain barrier very permeable. In other words, glucose can flood in. If that lasted more than about 20 minutes, the brain could drain the body of glucose, which would kill you. So the reduction, well, actually, yeah, I'm getting one step ahead of myself. So that after the 20 minutes, the pericytes tighten the blood-brain barrier, make it less permeable to preserve glucose in the bloodstream and in the body. But what happens is not only does the blood-brain barrier return to the previous level of permeability, the pericytes actually restrict it, make it even a little bit less permeable from then on. The reason being, the brain is protecting the body from itself, protecting the body from the brain draining the body of glucose. So if there's more glucose staying in the blood consistently, then there's less chance the brain could drain the body of glucose with the next sympathetic activation. And so with every new sympathetic activation, the brain makes that blood-brain barrier tighter and tighter to leave more and more glucose in the blood to protect it against the next sympathetic activation. So it's another design feature of protection and safety net. And so the brain, God also made it, like we talked about a few minutes ago, God made the brain adaptable. So when it loses fuel, it can allocate fuel in different places due to the need of the moment and limit fuel other places that are less important in the moment. And so like a teenager will say, kind of in effect, what the heck, God? Why do I have acne? Their brain has decided that fueling regulation of their immune system and their skin is less important than fueling their memory. So the brain made a choice. It didn't fuel, again, the skin and the immune system fully, which resulted in acne, but it was for a more important purpose in the brain's estimation. So did that, I know that was a long answer, did that answer the question? Okay. Which part didn't it answer?
Why did God do that?
Yeah, he did it because of the possibility of glucose limitations with the fall. And so he needed a safety net system to protect us from dying immediately. So by having this progressive limitation or reduction of fuel to the brain and preserving it in the body, the brain can adapt, the body can't really adapt. So the brain is protecting the body. God designed it that way through the glucose limitations. Any other questions before we go to rehumanization? Oh, sorry. This was going to be a 2-for-1 question.
My question is about people who live in constant trauma. Especially, you think about I think about people who are in the Holocaust, or they live in that fight or flight for several, maybe 3 years. Mm-hmm. And you do see that things do shut down. But is there a way for them to kind of get restored from that after?
Yes. So God made it so there's, again, another backup system. But there's a way to get glucose to the brain separate from the digestive system. The normal way the brain gets fueled is we eat food. A portion of that food is converted to glucose in the gut and in the liver. And then that gets to the brain via the blood system. And it's regulated, like we were talking about, by the blood-brain barrier and by those pericytes. But we can get glucose to the brain via a different pathway than the bloodstream. And it's still not yet been deliberately or definitively proven. My opinion is, and it's only an opinion, it's backed up by some research, but that the glucose gets it when we ingest it. You can take glucose directly. When you ingest it, that gets to the brain via the cerebral spinal fluid. Again, that's not proven. I think that's what's happening, but we do know for sure the glucose gets to the brain via a different pathway, because when you ingest it, it gets to the brain within probably 5 to 10 seconds. So there's not time for it to get to the stomach, from the stomach, through the heart, to the brain. And so God designed it, again, geniusly, but there's an alternate way to get glucose directly to the brain. It's also interesting, paramedics carry with them a tube of what's called D50, which stands for dextrose 50. Dextrose and glucose are the same thing. And it's an ointment. If somebody is comatose or even semi-responsive, they'll take the D50 and they'll rub it on the jawline, and that absorbs to the brain almost immediately, like probably within less than a second. So there are at least 2 pathways, maybe more, that get glucose directly to the brain. And so we can get the brain refueled, which will eliminate the physical and mental and emotional effects of trauma. And trauma meaning head injuries, or trauma meaning psychological trauma, like abuse of various kinds, or even seeing something horrific and being frightened. All of those things activate the sympathetic nervous system, limit glucose to the brain, but can be completely restored. Yes?
I just had a situation happen years ago when I was just early teens, late teens, early 20s. I was put in a situation where I went to jail 5 times in 4 days, for something I didn't do. I was just wrong.
That's like me.
Yeah, with the wrong people. So, and then I get home and a bunch of stuff happened. They were asking me questions. I said, really, I don't want to bother right now. I was having like a panic attack. And I went in the refrigerator and drank a glass of milk. And immediately, as soon as the milk went down, the panic attack left. And I don't know, I know there's something called tryptophan in the milk. And although you do it with, warm milk will enhance it. But at that moment, it just left. I had to say that it had something to do with the milk. It just immediately left. It didn't go, before it hit my stomach, practically it left. So it must have got into my tongue or, it just, it was, I thought about that just now.
Yes, and lactose comes from milk. Lactose is a type of sugar, and lactose gets converted to glucose. And so when people take glucose, that immediately eliminates panic attacks. But you got enough lactose from drinking the milk that was converted to glucose, and that's why your panic attack stopped. So you were right. It absolutely was the milk. It's kind of interesting, God promised the Israelites that they would be going to a land flowing with milk and honey. Honey is 40% dextrose, and milk contains a significant amount of lactose, which again gets converted to glucose, which God designed to be the fuel for our bodies and our brains. So, great question.
I had a question about the milk. is the goat milk? Because I have not read about cow milk in the Bible.
I believe, yes, any kind of milk, there's lactose. Because animals function very similarly in many respects physiologically to humans. And so animals need glucose as well. And there is lactose, I believe, in every animal's milk.
But I think, I don't know if someone has read in the Bible.
If what?
If someone has read in the Bible if it's goat milk, because God promised the milk, but what is the best to drink for us?
Interestingly, I was speaking at a conference in Oklahoma a couple weeks ago, and it was sponsored by a group called Hee Haw for Health, and they promote donkey's milk. And they say donkey's milk is actually the healthiest. I don't claim to be a milk expert, so I don't know if I can tell you which is the best milk. I will say that glucose or dextrose is better because it's more efficient than lactose in terms of fueling our brains and bodies. Was there a question? Yes, but not in the way people think. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, so.
Just repeat the question.
Yeah. Sorry.
The brain we don't use fully.
Right, right.
And did that have something to do with sin and dehumanization?
Yes. Yeah. Yep. It had everything to do with the dehumanization, the sympathetic nervous system activation, and the progressive loss of glucose or fuel to the brain. So we can't use all of our brain when our brain doesn't have enough fuel. And so that's the reason why people are able to use progressively less and less of their brain as injuries accumulate, as glucose limitations accumulate. So, great question. So let's talk about rehumanization. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is about ketosis.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how does that affect things when you're severely limiting the amount of glucose that you're taking?
Right. Yeah, great question. And some of this isn't known or hasn't been definitively proven with research yet, but it appears that, well, let me go back a second. So ketosis is basically burning fat via what are called ketones that then is used for fuel. And nobody goes into ketosis when they're getting any carbohydrates or any glucose in their diet. So when you eliminate carbs, ketone bodies are produced. Those burn fat. And interestingly, very interestingly, fat essentially is a different name for long-term stored glucose. So when you go into ketosis, you're burning this long-term storage of glucose, but it's a very inefficient system, so you don't get that much, and the recommendation is typically don't be on the keto diet for more than about 6 to 12 months, because God designed that as another safety net. Ketosis is really the third level fueling system. Your brain can't get enough glucose to fully function simply from burning the long-term stored glucose through ketosis. So what happens is, though, that the glucose coming from ketosis isn't limited in the same way that the glucose that we eat is limited. So people will talk about, well, I went on the keto diet and all of a sudden my memory was better. Or I went on the keto diet and all of a sudden I could pay attention. Or I went on the keto diet and all of a sudden I didn't have brain fog anymore. The reason is they're getting a little bit of unrestricted glucose. Unlike when you're eating food that food gets converted to glucose, it goes to your brain, it's limited by the pericytes and by the blood-brain barrier. That doesn't happen with ketosis. So does that answer the question? So the Bible is really more about rehumanization than dehumanization. The story of the Bible is about redemption. It's about restoration. And that is the gospel. And we see in Psalm 23:3, 1 Peter 5:10, and there's some other verses talking about humans being restored. And again, rehumanization is more of a technical, philosophical term, but is really, again, what the gospel is talking about. We go from being dead, quote unquote, being dehumanized, being less than functional, to being rehumanized. And so we'll talk about that in a little more detail. So one of the things that my book talks about is restoration science or restoration theology. And I put the steps there, but the primary fuels that every plant, every animal, every human must have are water, oxygen, and glucose. If any living thing doesn't have enough of any of those things, it will kill you. If you have some, but not enough, then your function will be limited. And arguably, glucose is the most important fuel. Humans will live longer they'll die faster from lack of glucose than they will from lack of water. Humans must have glucose in their bodies and their brains to survive. And not only did you not think you were going to hear about interuterine developmental processes, you probably also didn't think you were going to hear about naked mole rats. But we're going to talk a little about naked mole rats as well, a common topic in churches. So a very fascinating study was done that, and I don't know who thought to do this, but naked mole rats were put in a chamber with 0 oxygen. And then they also put other rodents in the chamber with 0 oxygen. Most rodents lived about 2 to 3 minutes with no oxygen. Naked mole rats, on the other hand, lived 18 minutes on average with no oxygen at all. And so they, of course, were curious, why did the naked mole rats live so much longer? And as it turned out, they had a much more efficient glucose storage and glucose distribution system. And that was the only difference. So glucose is even very important for not only naked mole rats, but all living things in oxygen utilization and having more oxygen created and available. So glucose is the primary fuel, but go ahead, Dave.
What are some of the immediate signs of glucose deficiency?
How long do we have? So some of the most common are headaches, ear ringing, anxiety, brain fog, low energy, sleep difficulties, depression, anger, irritability, impatience. Interestingly, kind of the opposite of the image of God in many ways. But there's a much, much, much longer list, but that's some of the more common ones. So in the rehumanization process, so the primary fuels are water, oxygen, and glucose. Restoring fuels equals restoring function. And that's really an incredible statement that when our bodies and brains have the right amount, a full amount of the primary fuels, they will function fully. not only in this case, not only in that case, not only possibly. When your brain and your body, again, have the right amount, enough of water, oxygen, glucose, you will function fully. And God designed us so that we can be restored. When those primary fuels are restored, all function is restored. And that includes a long list, actually a complete and exhaustive list of physical ailments. So I've treated people with pulmonary fibrosis, which is fibrous masses in their lungs. And that is, by definition in the medical literature, untreatable. But when we get their brains refueled, the fibrosis goes away. I've treated a guy with cardiac amyloidosis, easy for me to say, which basically is part of the heart not functioning. When that person's brain got restored with glucose, his heart fully recovered. Diabetes, autism, schizophrenia, all the things we want to think about as kind of the incurable things. God designed us so nothing is incurable. Other than, like, if your leg's cut off, glucose isn't going to restore that. Neither is water or oxygen. I know, sorry, Ronnie. So I make a distinction between what I call mechanical injuries. So like if you break your leg, glucose won't set your leg. If you break your leg and you don't get it set, those bones will still be disjointed no matter how much of the primary fuels you have. But for non-mechanical problems, God designed us so we are fully, completely restorable. And one of the very interesting things that happens is that when the brain is refueled, that is absolutely necessary for eliminating the person's internal dehumanization. The brain stops saying there's some defect in you. The brain stops saying there's something wrong with you. And so you are rehumanized. Kind of an interesting side note, though, that we learn from society, unfortunately from our parents at times, from siblings, from friends, because of their dehumanization of themselves and us, we learn from them that there's something wrong with us. So in addition to taking glucose, it takes learning the truth that we're talking about tonight, learning the truth about yourself, that there is no deficit or defect in you in any way, no matter what your behavior is. So a person cannot do anything to make themselves less worthy, to make themselves less whole, to make themselves less complete. Nothing you do. So I kind of joke with people sometimes and say, if you went and bought an AK-47 and went and killed 300 people, that would not make you any less worthy than you are right now. Conversely, if you had $20 billion and devoted or donated all of that to orphans, that would not make you any more worthy than you are right now. Our worthiness comes from God having made us in His image, from Him having created us to reflect Him, from Him having created us whole and complete in every way, including being able to be fully restored. So restoring function equals rehumanization, number 3 there. And then rehumanization equals restoration of the image of God. When we are fueled, we will function fully as a human. We will fully demonstrate God's image. And it's a very interesting thing, and I've experienced this myself, that as my brain became more and more and then fully fueled, that I would be talking to my wife. Thank you. I would be talking to my wife, and my brain would edit what I was saying on the fly. So instead of saying something impatient, instead of saying something critical, my brain catches it in the moment and retranslates it either into, how about not saying anything at all, which is often a good thing, or why don't you say it this way? And that is full human function as God designed us to be loving, to be gracious, to be merciful, to be compassionate, to be patient. Those things happen when we are functioning fully, when we are back to functioning the way God created us to. And Imago Dei there, that's Latin fancy words for image of God. But so the restoration science, restoration theology is, again, back to when we are fully fueled, we will fully function. Physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. That's how God made us. And it was at the fall, when there was a glucose limitation, that we began to not represent his image. That the word sin, hamartia, means missing the mark. We began missing the mark of his image. We became idolatrous, thinking we could do better for ourselves than he could do. That we needed to compensate. We needed to concoct schemes to trick people into thinking we were worthy, that we were acceptable, instead of trusting that God made us fully, completely acceptable. So the gospel restores the individual. The New Testament really, in an unprecedented way, in an unduplicated way, focuses on the individual. God's creation of individuals, God's relationship with individuals, not collectively, not in a group way, not in a national way, but individually. And the focus on us as individuals in our relationship to him translates to when we are more fully fueled, when we are humanized, and the more people in a society or a culture that are humanized, there will be love, there will be compassion, there will be mercy, there will be charity, there will be looking out for people, there will be self-sacrifice. And so that the individual freedom and value is the most important value by God. God places the most important value. The New Testament is devoted to individuals and their relationship with God. And so I put on there a quick rabbit trail, I don't know if you can see it, about hope with politics and Trump. So, and I think I said this, but this may be one of those places where there was a little bit of a jump. So, when we understand our infinite worthiness, when we understand that God made us fully functional, when we understand that death is not real, that we go immediately from living in this dimension to living in the other dimension or heaven with him, that eliminates the fear of death. Being restored, being rehumanized, eliminates the fear, existential fear of worthlessness. So, what can a politician do to us when we've been rehumanized? When we know our safety cannot be damaged. We can't become unsafe. There's nothing dangerous to us. The very worst thing that would happen is we will go from this dimension to the dimension with God. And so when you understand that, political movements become far less threatening, become far less frightening. I think we want to be associated with political movements that are humanizing, not dehumanizing. Abortion is dehumanizing. The transgender, or whatever gender you think you want to be, is dehumanizing. The you need our control to function is dehumanizing. We're controlling your income is dehumanizing. But we don't have to fear, again, governments or politics when we know we have been rehumanized, when we know we're safe. And so it's kind of interesting, I think, about Trump. He very definitely talks about individual freedom. He very definitely is for humanizing and rehumanizing values. But it's kind of interesting, his rhetoric is dehumanizing sometimes. He ridicules, he demeans, he's dismissive, and I think that's part of the reason why even intrinsically some people react negatively to him, because God designed us to react negatively to dehumanization, no matter where it comes from. If you have a boss that disrespects you, that creates tension and friction, is dehumanizing. You don't want to be in that environment. If a friend puts you down all the time, that friend will become a little more distant because we don't want to be close to them because they're dehumanizing. And so I think, unfortunately, Trump kind of shoots himself in the foot by dehumanizing rhetoric. If he would include humanizing rhetoric with his humanizing policies, I don't know that it's a race anyway, but especially if it's honest, but it wouldn't be a race at all if Trump was verbally humanizing as well as being policy humanizing. So the rehumanization or restoration outcomes, elimination, like I said, of the existential fears, hope, meaning the certainty of well-being, and rehumanizing behaviors, like I talked about husbands and wives being able to be loving with each other, not having to be self-protective and criticizing so I don't feel quite as bad about myself. Or I'm not afraid you're going to reject me, so I need to push you away first. Rehumanizing of families. Parents being really honest with kids about that behavior wasn't appropriate, but I love you fully, and that behavior doesn't change you as a person. You need to learn to behave differently, but you are fully human, you are fully worthy regardless of what you do. And then also practicing that in society, in the workplace, in interaction with other people. The one that's probably hardest for me in traffic. To wave somebody in front of you is not a huge thing, but it's humanizing. It is being giving to another person. But I want to go back for a second to hope. And again, hope meaning certainty of well-being. One of the examples I use with people fairly frequently is what I called, it's 10 minutes before dinner. And that's the way I explain human suffering. So any of you that have children or have observed children, when it gets to be 10 minutes before dinner, that child can become very fussy. And as it gets closer to dinner and they're not getting food, they go past fussy to screaming. And you can tell that that child believes they're in mortal danger, that this is the worst thing that could have ever happened. And we as parents don't like to see it, and it's sad in a way, but we also know there's no danger. We know in 10 minutes that child's going to be eating, that child will be happy, that child will be content. There's no danger whatsoever. I think God views suffering that same way for us. When we look at a momentary, and even if momentary means a whole lifetime of suffering, is that sad? Yes. Would we want to eliminate it if we can? Yes. Is there any benefit to pain and suffering? Probably not. But at the same time, from God's perspective, when you compare even a whole lifetime, if somebody has been trafficked, if somebody has been beaten, if somebody has lived in poverty, those are horrible things. That should never happen to anybody. But it doesn't diminish that person's humanness, nor does it diminish them being fully restored at the time of their death, if not before. And so God, I think, looks at it as, yes, it is a bad thing in terms of he doesn't like anybody to suffer. He doesn't like anybody to be in pain. But he also understands, in the grand scheme of things, it's not harmful or destructive, nor is it anything but just 10 minutes when compared to eternity. And so he has compassion, he loves us, he's supportive, but doesn't look at it as a crisis.
At the time of coming to acknowledge there's a God, like in my experience, I was in a jail cell, I had no hope, and I cried out, and I had this flood of joy. And all of a sudden, I realized this is God. And that all of a sudden, God, there's something happened that changed my thinking that he's real. He's there. I don't understand it, but he's there. Is that, what's going on?
What a great question. And did you look at my slides ahead of time? Because that question goes right to hope realized. Again, the certainty is experienced. Every single one of us in this room, every single person in the universe outside this room has hope, has the expectation, the reality of being restored. And so God's house is another analogy which I think will answer your question. So one way to think about it is, like I said, God is in a different dimension. He's in heaven. We're on this earth. Most of the time, we can't see him physically because of being in a different dimension, and also because of, and I would say there's not enormous direct evidence of this scripturally, but I think it's true that God can't allow dehumanization or anything undermining him in his presence. That it's fundamentally incompatible with dehumanization is fundamentally incompatible with who he is. So he can't allow it in his presence, which is why we're not in heaven right now. Because of the fall, because of progressive glucose limitation, because of loss of function, because of defacing of the image of God in us, he can't allow us in his presence with those conditions. And Habakkuk 1:13 references it kind of indirectly. Genesis 3:24 references it kind of indirectly. But we can think of it as God is in his house, a house like we have, and he does not allow anyone to come in with mud on their shoes. That's the equivalent of dehumanization. If you have mud on your shoes, you can't come in my house. And I don't know if any of you had mothers like mine, but that was one of her rules, that you will not enter if there's mud on your shoes. So you can take off the shoes and come on in. When we transition, what people call death, but when we transition from this dimension to the other dimension, my view is we are fully, completely restored if we haven't been restored before then. So the muddy shoes are off. But what about while we're living here and when we're not restored and we have muddy shoes? God doesn't sit in his house and say, I don't care if you're thirsty. I don't care if you're hungry. I don't care if it's raining. I don't care if it's snowing. I don't care if it's cold. I don't care if there's a bear out there. No. God will stand at the door and knock, a la Revelation 3:20, and communicate to us and say, I love you. I am here for you. I watch out for you and protect you, like you're talking about in the jail cell. You didn't go, fortunately for us, you didn't go to God's house at that point in time. But he didn't also fully let you into his presence and in a relationship with him while you had mud on your shoes. But he talked to you. He comforted you. He told you, in effect, everything's going to be fine. And so God isn't mad at us when we have mud on our shoes. It isn't like, oh, you're a wretch. Oh, I hate you. You're no good. You're defective. You're a worthless piece of trash. He says, no. I want to talk to you. I want to protect you. I'll give you an umbrella. I'll give you a bed to sleep on the porch. I'll cover you up. I'll keep you warm. I'll put a space heater out. I will do everything to communicate my love, but I cannot tolerate dehumanization in my presence. So, people have historically thought that him not tolerating sin in his presence meant the alternative is to have the escape lever or hatch and you go the chute straight to hell. That's his solution to not allowing dehumanization or something unworthy of him in his presence. I think actually what happens is he chooses instead to restore us. Jesus died to restore us so we could get the mud off our shoes, so we could be in his presence with him, not contaminating the place where he is. And I think that is the ultimate in love. I've got a friend who does foster care, and he's adopted one kid and currently has 4 other foster kids. And he used to have 5 foster kids, but the 5th foster kid is a teenage girl, and a tragic story, as you can imagine, physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, etc., etc. But at 12 years old, she refused to stop dehumanizing the other kids and my friend. Her presence in that house created a lot of friction, a lot of tension, a lot of dehumanization, a lot of anguish. So he finally decided, I can't have this in my house. It is destructive to everybody in here. It's even destructive to her to let her continue to dehumanize herself and everybody else. So he called social services and said, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to place her in a different home. And on a human level, he had created kind of the equivalent of Eden in his house. Nobody was allowed to dehumanize anybody else. If somebody did, he would talk to him and reaffirm his love for them, reaffirm that even though you have mud on your shoes, I don't dislike you, I don't want you to be away from me. I don't want you to lack anything, but we just can't have that in this house. And again, I think that's how God is, that he can't allow his presence to be contaminated. He can't allow other people in his presence to have to deal with that abrasiveness of dehumanization. So his solution is Jesus died to get the mud off the shoes. And he will reach out to us in a number of ways to let us know he's there, to let us know he loves us, to let us know we have access to that house. But it has to be without the mud on the shoes. So sorry, I think I went a little long. I apologize. Any questions before we wrap up?
So what are our best sources of glucose?
Probably the one that most people use is they buy what's called dextrose powder. Dextrose is exactly the same thing as glucose. And you can just go online, Amazon, Google, whatever, and search for dextrose powder. Or visit a brewery. Old West Home Brewery on Pikes Peak in Colorado Springs has it. Fermentations in Colorado Springs has it. You can buy it in minute quantities, meaning 2 pounds, like at natural grocers. But it's easier and cheaper to get it online in bigger quantities. And the one thing I should say, I think people have inferred, and Ronnie actually said it, but I do treat people, get them restored. But it's exceedingly difficult to take glucose on your own and be able to do it effectively. You really need guidance through the process. The brain chooses at any given moment what function it's going to fuel, and that means by definition underfueling other things. So symptoms can be intermittent, and that can be pretty confusing to people. So I highly, highly recommend that people work with me, or I've trained 3 people now to do this process. So me or one of the other people. And just so you know, it's not a money-making scheme. The way I do my fees is that people pay what they can afford. So if somebody can afford 0, they pay 0. If somebody can afford 5, they pay 5. I tell people nobody pays less than 0, so I'm not going to pay you myself for you to do this. But nobody pays more than $175 either per meeting, and the $175 or even the higher numbers are for people that can afford it, so they support people that can't. And all my trainees are working on the same policy. So it isn't, again, if you can afford nothing, you pay nothing. Probably 25% of the people I work with pay nothing. And I don't ever turn anybody away and say, well, my 0 fee slots are full. I don't have any cap like that, which providers that do what it's called pro bono work, which is for free, many of them will say, well, I have 5 slots or I have 10 slots or whatever. But it really is literally every person, whatever they can pay, even if it's nothing, that's what they pay.
Wanted to kind of let you guys know. So yeah, this is good. It took a little bit of time. I think what we're going to do is we're going to wrap with questions. And there's a couple areas. There's the individual questions about like just the one that was just asked, and perhaps you have one because it sounds like this could be very relevant to the thing that you're experiencing already. Also, if any of you have any questions about application, because the context of these weeks was we want to practically engage hope while the culture around us is battling to dehumanize.
Right.
And
yes.
So I'd like, if any of you have any questions about application that may not directly be just the glucose therapy, maybe how we think or how we listen or what we don't listen to or how we humanize ourselves or somebody else. So let's not worry about time so much. I don't know how much time we've actually got, but I'm going to go tell Laurel we're not going to try to squeeze worship in as an afterthought tonight. Anybody that has any of those application questions or any of the practical or any of the glucose related questions, let's just put some energy into that, because you suggested things like restoration of families, a sense of personal worth, a certainty of life. These are big deals. So here.
I have a problem with glucose.
Mm-hmm.
I have just too much. And so I guess I'm wondering I guess an application would be perfect, is what would I do?
Yeah, and it's a fascinating thing that I've treated hundreds, literally, of people with either type 1 or type 2 diabetes, or the magical term pre-diabetes. Every single one of them, as they take more glucose, their blood sugar lowers. And the issue is blood sugar and body sugar, or body and blood glucose and brain glucose, are two different systems. They're not the same thing. There's a lot of overlap, but when the brain glucose is low, what it does is activate the liver to dump stored glucose into the blood, so the brain hopefully can get some more glucose from that. And it keeps activating the liver to dump more and more glucose into the blood so it can get some more. But because of the limitation I talked about, it doesn't get all of that glucose that the liver dumps into the blood. So, by getting your brain fueled with glucose via the different pathway, then that lowers the body glucose, because the brain stops triggering the liver to dump stored glucose into the blood. And so when people take enough glucose, which sounds crazy, but when people take enough glucose, their blood sugars go down to the 95 to 105 range.
So how would I do that?
You would take glucose, and I can talk to you separately. And like I said, it's very important to work with me, or like I said, one of my trainees, through the process. And again, finances is never an issue. But
okay, I live in Southern California.
Yeah, I do Zoom. I have a client in Denmark right now.
Oh, really?
I have clients in Canada. I have clients in Australia, and all throughout the U.S.
Okay.
So I do Zoom or phone for people that are out of state.
All right. Thank you.
This is more of a comment for others. When I met Dr. Dave and I had gone to a couple of his seminars, I decided to try this, and one of the questions I had for him was similar to Richard in the sense that it led to the next thing he was going to talk about. And that had to do with ingesting, or in other words, drinking, usually adding dextrose into liquid and drinking it, goes right in to where the brain needs to use it and bypasses your stomach to a degree.
Right, mostly.
And because of that, it ignores the blood-brain barrier thing.
Right.
I didn't know the terminology
Yeah,
before.
no, you got it.
But so this is, he talked about 3 ways. There's eating food, let your normal digestion happen, and then glucose gets to the brain, which is limited.
Limited, yes.
Or ingest it, like just adding it to juice or something.
Yeah.
Water.
Anything but alcohol is my recommendation.
Okay.
I know, sorry.
And then the third was doing the ketosis thing.
Yeah, the
I think.
ketosis will not refuel your brain.
Okay. So just get ready to buy 50-pound bags of dextrose. It does help.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, Ronnie.
No.
Question, yes.
When there's been brain damage as an infant, or such as inoculations that's taken place, is that irreversible?
No. The only thing that's irreversible is, like I talked about, quote unquote, birth defects. So if you don't grow a hand or fingers or that sort of thing, glucose won't restore that. But any kind of vaccination injury, any kind of neonate injury, even glucose deprivation intrauterинally, all of that can be fully restored. And I've treated, I don't know what the number is, dozens for sure, of people with autism, and they're completely restored as well.
The situation I'm referring to is an individual that I'm in relationship that has seizures.
Uh-huh. Seizures totally eliminated. Seizure disorders really are, the brain doesn't have enough fuel to regulate muscle control.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yes, yes.
So you said something, I remember during some of our sessions, that talked about value, our own value based on our actions, and things that we do don't change our value.
Right.
Can you expand a little on that? Because to me, that's a big part of what God thinks about us.
Right.
And what we, versus what we think about us.
Right.
And how maybe some of this dextrose stuff can help us in that sense.
Yes. Yeah, great question. And so, like I said, from the very first glucose limitation, our brain, because it continuously scans inside itself, inside our bodies, our environment, looking for threats. And when glucose lowers and stays lowered in the absence of any current threat, then the brain's kind of only conclusion is there must be something defective in me. And as the glucose level goes to the brain goes like that, then the interpretation of there's something wrong with me grows and grows and grows. And because the brain isn't fueling the body and itself enough, then there is progressive lack of control of behavior. So maybe I kick something, or maybe I punch a hole in the wall, or maybe I lie to my mother. So doing all those things is evidence of low glucose, but the brain interprets it as, well, yes, my brain's telling me there's something wrong, and look, there's this and this and this and this that I did, so that proves I'm defective. When in fact, there's no deficit or defect at all. I tell people that there's zero connection or zero correlation between behavior and worthiness, or between behavior and value. And another analogy I've started using with people is, anybody in here ever have a car that you would call a junker? Or an undependable one? So when you went out to get in your car, there was probably the question, is this thing gonna start? Or if it starts, will it keep running? Or when I get 10 blocks away, will it stop running? For a variety of reasons. And so you just come to know that this car is unreliable, that this car is defective. Alternatively, how many of you have had a new car or a reliable car? Probably many of you. When you have a reliable car, you go out, you turn the key, and you know it'll start. And your junker, you might not want to drive from here to Colorado Springs in because you think I may not make it. Your reliable car, you would drive to Canada in and not give it a second thought. You trust that that car is going to work. lowered glucose and being dehumanized by yourself and other people and by the accuser or Satan all results in me thinking I'm the junker. I can't trust myself. Sure, I might have a good day. I might be able to accomplish a few things, but that's just today. I know tomorrow there's going to be a problem. I know somebody's going to shun me. Someone's going to criticize me. I'm going to do something bad. I'm not going to function very well, and that's just a given. That's the effect of dehumanization. When you're fully fueled, you will know that you are, to use the analogy, you are much better than the best car ever made. There is no possibility of breakdown. The one that designed you is the flawless designer of the universe. The one that assembled you, so to speak, wasn't drunk over the weekend and didn't connect a few things on the assembly line. He connected everything perfectly, fully, flawlessly. And you didn't get stuck with any bad parts. You didn't get stuck with a bad pancreas. You didn't get stuck with a bad liver. There wasn't some manufacturing flaw in the part that's going to make it break down. All the parts are perfect. And when there's enough fuel, all of those things function perfectly. And kind of ironically enough, when you have the new car, what's the one thing you pay attention to when you're driving? The fuel, the gas. And you know if there's enough fuel, that car will keep running flawlessly. And that's true 10, 20, 50, 100 times more with us as humans being designed by God. So it's a big hurdle for people to jump because their experience, their brains, everything has told them there's something wrong with you. You're not good enough. Society has dehumanized you by saying doctors, physicians, philosophers, teachers, everybody says there is something wrong with you because you're human. And that is simply not true. So you can fully, completely trust yourself. You can fully, completely trust that you can be completely rehumanized. That the mud can come off your shoes. You can interact with God now. You can go in his house in the next dimension. Sorry to make you hobble, Richard.
I had two major experiences in my life, and first one was the jail cell when I was young. Then
that you were working in.
Pardon me, yeah. And then things happened, and I told God to forget it. I'm out of here. Right. And there was always this thinking, you know, if you do bad things, God hates you. And I did a lot of bad things that I felt, how can I ever come back?
Right.
But when he came to me again, I realized it doesn't matter what you do.
Right. Right.
And because of that experience, my thinking has changed to where I know I may do something wrong, but it will never change how God sees me and loves me.
Right.
And it's changed a whole lot of things. And I come across people that struggle with, doubt and shame and all these various things that think that God is looking at them differently. And I say, no, I don't know how to express that's a lie, it is not true. And anyway, I'm so thankful that I have this place where I know it doesn't matter what I do, I'm never diminished
right.
in his eyes.
Right, yeah. Absolutely. And not only does God not see you differently, God knows you're not different. Just like a kid with muddy shoes, we don't think less of them. We don't think, oh man, you're a rotten kid because you have mud on your shoes. And so it's also true, and it's important because our brains are kind of tricky. Our brains, when they've decided, so to speak, and it usually happens in late adolescence or early adulthood, that our brain finally concludes there's been enough glucose limitation, there's been enough behaviors that I conclude I'm defective. There's something wrong with me. And so not only does God not see you as being defective, you cannot be defective. And God can't see you any other way because there isn't any other truth. Nothing you or me or anybody has ever done changes you in any way. So you're always above and beyond the best made car ever. Nothing can diminish that. And yeah, what a life-changing thing it is, right? Yes.
I want to share something with you. A lot of what you're saying, I learned several years ago. And the way I learned it was the Lord gave me a scripture. And he said, I want to talk to people myself. I don't want a prophet. I don't want anybody else. Because I'm gifted prophetically, so I did it a lot. And I said, what do you mean you want to say it yourself? And he said, people feel separated from me. They know I'm everywhere, but they feel separated from me.
Right.
And nobody speaks to that.
Yeah.
So I want to. So the first time we did it, I brought a lady who had been raped continuously from 2 years old until she was 21.
Yeah.
And a really kind man married her to get her out of that family. And the way she dealt with it, her response to the destruction was, it's not against my will. I don't have a choice.
Right.
She gave up her choice. So when we went to the Lord, she felt like he was a million miles away.
Right.
So we talked back and forth with the Lord until that bridge was gapped. And the Lord was where he could be heard. Mm-hmm. And she started to laugh. And I go, what are you laughing about? And she goes right to her head, and she goes, there's a short man right there. And he's, I said, what is he doing? Who is he? She goes, I don't know. He keeps saying, I am that I am. And I said, oh, so it's Jesus. She goes, no. I said, how do you know? And she goes, well, he's standing right there. You know, so
Yeah.
the Lord showed up.
Yeah.
He showed
Yeah.
up big time.
Right.
And so I said, okay, ask the Lord why that little man that says I am that I am is there. And her stomach started bouncing in and out like this. Mm-hmm. You know, I could see it.
Yeah.
And she laughed for 45 minutes. And then she went like this. And all of a sudden, she had a will. She could choose again.
Yeah.
She got up, and I said, wait a second, let's ask the Lord to say how he feels about you. And she says, oh, I know, he loves me. I said, no, ask the Lord yourself and let him answer you.
Yeah.
And he spoke to her value, that he loved when she came to him in prayer. He loved that she was there. And she walked out that door, and if you asked her to do anything, she would automatically do it. If you said hi to her, she would stop and talk to you, even if she was in a hurry. And she would wait and ask you for permission to leave. And when she walked out the door of my office, there were a bunch of ladies there who were all friends of hers. Normally it would have taken her half an hour to walk out the door. She goes, ladies, I got to go, and left. And everybody stood there with their jaw open because she was so different. She changed.
Yeah.
And the Lord gave her what she gave up. You know, she didn't do it consciously. She did it subconsciously. But he restored what she gave up. He restored it. And then he spoke to her about who she was. And for 4 years, that's all we did was we called it connecting prayer.
Right.
And the Lord immediately confronted the lies that kept people from him. He did it. We didn't even know how to lead people in this stuff for, for a lot of time. But as soon as they got in his presence, and he always left them with a message of how he felt about them. He always did, every single time. We probably saw 3,000 or 4,000 people, and the Lord always said how he felt, and those people's lives changed. They would come back and they would say, you know what I noticed? You know what I noticed? And they would say, I don't do this anymore. I don't do any of this thing anymore. And one guy came in, he goes, I used to drink every day until I was drunk. Yeah. He goes, I didn't touch a beer for 3 months before I found a beer in my back of my refrigerator, and I didn't want it. Yeah. Just the Lord speaking the value restored those things. And it's like he always went after the lie. Whatever they believed that wasn't true, he spoke something different. And because they heard it from him, they couldn't argue that, well, you told me that, or they said that, because the Lord himself spoke it into their lives.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, he restored and rehumanized, and he used you as a vehicle for restoration and rehumanization. And
you just brought him to the Lord.
Right.
Let him say it.
And like I said at the beginning, he directed that cloud to be on the cover of this book. His picture, and everything that I'm talking about tonight isn't me, it's him restoring people. And I don't think we want to take the time for the story, but he, in October of 2017, woke me up in the middle of the night with triglucose. And he has continued to reveal more and more about humanity as he made us and about rehumanizing. And so, yes, it's him. He is the restorer. He is the rehumanizer.
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of go back to how glucose comes to us in time of crisis, okay? Yeah. So recently I was at a party, and a fire broke out. And many of us rushed to take care of that fire. And in the course of that, talking to a few people and realizing my own week, having talked to them, it felt like I was kind of working like through sluggish water. Mm-hmm. And then listening to you tonight, I realized, okay, so we had that, people call it adrenaline rush, I guess.
Right, yeah.
So we all had that. But how long does it take the body to kind of bring that glucose back up so that you don't feel that way? Because, right now I feel pretty good. Yeah. But throughout, like Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, it just felt like I was swimming through really, and then talking to a few other people, they did too. So I was kind of curious, how long does it take to kind of get that back together?
Which is a great question and kind of a complicated answer.
Oh, okay.
But there's what's called the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay. And that kicks in after the sympathetic nervous system has activated and helps restore. But having your sympathetic nervous system activated burned a lot of glucose. And you were getting some restored from your diet over the course of several days. And the kind of conventional wisdom is that the brain doesn't store glucose at all. But so I'm going to add to the things you never thought you'd hear about tonight. Not only the intrauterine development, not only naked mole rats, but there's also astrocytic infeed. And so in the brain, the cells, there's neurons, and then there's what are called glial cells, which are kind of connecting and serve other functions. And the astrocytes are part of a glial cell, and they're actually more numerous than neurons. And a part of the astrocyte, the input, so to speak, stores glucose. Oh. And so the brain preferentially uses glucose from the storage first, and then the storage gets refilled. If you're taking glucose, you can get the storage completely refilled. But even from our diet, the brain, again, will preferentially work on refilling the storage. So that's why it took several days for you to kind of feel back on your feet again.
Thanks.
Yep.
I've been on like a keto diet lately, and I used to do it years ago for weights and stuff like that. But
yeah,
you get older, it's a little bit different thing, and it's your body screams, at you because your mood swings get off hand, and so I think maybe with dextrose, taking the dextrose separate from it and regulated, I think that would probably be the answer to the situation, right?
It would, absolutely.
Yeah.
So like I talked about, and I really am calling this restoration science and theology, but when you have the full amount of glucose and water and oxygen, you will function fully.
Yeah.
The glucose you get from the keto diet is a fraction of what you need. So by taking glucose, you will be fully restored. And again, God designed us so when we're fully fueled, we will fully function in our bodies, in our brains, in everything.
Yeah, because in the American diet, there's a lot of things we don't need, you know?
Right.
We can function a little bit and get by perfectly,
Yeah, yep, exactly. True. That's the fourth primary fuel.
Yeah, and then my niece, her baby, she's not autism, but there's another one. I forget what it is.
Down syndrome?
There you go. And can that be helped?
Yes.
So I really want to find a way of helping her out, and they were really concerned. But the babies, they thought it was born with a bad heart or a hole in his heart, but it seemed like it covered up. So God, prayer is working for it. So I just, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, another quick story. I've got a nephew who's 32 years old, and he was born, they said, with a chromosome 18 disorder. And so he was IQ tested at age 14 or 15, and the average IQ is 100. He got an IQ score in the 20s. So what would be called profoundly retarded. And he still can't eat solid food. His parents have to grind it up, and then he can eat it, but he can't really chew very well. But a couple years ago, he took glucose for a couple of years. And before that, he would never, ever be in the house by himself and had to be fully taken care of. After taking glucose for a couple of years, he is capable of staying on his own. He now has 2 jobs. And really, his only difficulty is he can't pronounce words. If you ask a question, he's on his computer and he answers it faster than anybody. And he has a little app on his phone that he can hit a button that he's programmed in a bunch of phrases. But his IQ now is probably in the 80s. So kind of amazing and kind of a funny story. My wife's a kindergarten teacher, and she apologizes, by the way, to everybody that she's not here tonight. They had a fundraiser that was planned back in August that just happened to be on this night, and she couldn't get away. But anyway, so she teaches kindergarten, and he wanted to go meet her kindergartners. And so she said, well, why don't you read them a story? So he programmed into his phone the whole story. And he stood up in front of them and hit the button and had the story read to them. And they loved it, he loved it. But then it was kind of funny after that, in the next few days and weeks, if there was a computer thing that she couldn't solve, they would say, hey, have Mr. Kelvin come and help you. He knows how to work the computer. So that kind of gives you an idea of his functional level, even though he can't speak intelligibly or not intelligibly, he can't speak understandably.
I'm wondering, you know, it's, I guess the glucose, the inhibition or, I guess, allowance of production of growth hormone, and maybe even neuron or neural pathways. If you can create more, does that help more glucose circulate, like more growth hormone?
Yes.
That repairs the body and
yes,
and
yeah, so
restores you, like
neurotransmitters, which are the chemical messengers in the brain, require glucose to be produced. And glucose, interestingly, I don't know how many of you are familiar with multiple sclerosis or MS. It is what's called a demyelinating illness, which means it erodes the myelin, which is like the covering for neurons. Okay. And glucose restores the myelin. And so does help make more connections, does facilitate chemical conversation within the brain. So yes, absolutely, it does all of that.
You know, I've kind of been batting around some things. So Answitz is doing some research on some neuropathway regeneration, and
yeah,
I've been kind of working with something, and you know, I've been sitting in this back for I don't know how long, and I can't read the screen.
Oh,
and it's like 8K right now. I mean, my vision is completely restored. I think
that is so great.
Kind of neat, though.
Yeah, very exciting.
But I'm kind of incorporating like royal jelly, and I'm sure that's got a dextrose, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah.
But maybe I can kind of talk to you like
sure.
After.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, one more question.
I got a friend that has Parkinson's disease, so I just wanted to see what can be done about that.
Yeah, glucose will eliminate it.
Okay.
All right. Partly, I guess it's getting a little slick outside, so we are going to have to wrap. I just sent you, if you're on the text thing, I just sent you a short link that will take you to Dave's book on Amazon. If you don't get the Joyland text, those of you that are visiting tonight, see me before you go, and I'll get you that. I'll somehow get that link to you and text it to you. Anyway, ponder this, okay? Ponder this, not only the mechanical medical part, ponder that. And for those of you that are asking these questions, stuff you're experiencing, is your contact information on your book?
Actually, I don't think it is.
Okay, if somebody wants your number, can I give it to them?
Please.
Okay.
Yep.
So we'll do that, and I don't really want to be the big bottleneck. If you want to get Dave's number before you go ahead and do that, so you can talk to him, because really he will help you.
Or I can just say it too.
Yeah, that would work. If you guys want to write it down. So get your phones ready, and after I'm done talking, he'll give you his phone number.
Yep.
But for those of us that have been tracking on this hope thing, think of how key it is, this idea of overcoming dehumanization, or if you want to make it sound maybe more palatable, the fact that we are persuaded to live below being human.
Right.
And think of some, I thought of a couple passages of scripture, and I won't be quoting this one 100% correct, but at the end of chapter 7 of Romans, Paul says, "Oh, wretched man that I am." And people, if you're not careful, you'll use that to assert that men are wretched. But that's not what he says. He says, you know, who's going to help me? And the very next verse is there's no condemnation. I mean, just a couple verses later, there's no condemnation in Christ. The other one is in Romans 3:23, where it talks about all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And I've always harped on the fact, but the next verse says, and are forgiven freely by grace. And it goes on and gets even better. We have a tendency to think righteousness and value and glory is temporary, and sin is permanent until it gets, in this one act of forgiveness or something, cleaned up a little bit like that. But that's the wrong way to understand what's going on. Think about what it really says when it says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. What is the glory of God? The glory of God is his image. It's who he is. It's his shining. It's his brightness. That's the image we're made in. That is what Christ died to restore. That is what we see when we look in a mirror in 2 Corinthians 5. We see the Lord reflected in 2 Corinthians 3 or 4. That idea, when we behold in a mirror the glory of the Lord, where the Spirit of the Lord is, live. Do you see what? So I know it's probably a little hard to hear how bluntly David says stuff like, there's nothing you can do to diminish your value, because we're not conditioned to that. We're conditioned to measure our value against an ever-changing, dualistic, flexible set of judgment criteria instead of who are you? We've talked about Katie Scourgia. I don't know if you've ever met Katie Scourgia or got it in her books. She talks about poo-covered diamonds.
Oh, yeah.
How valuable, or how much value does a diamond lose when it's covered in poo? The answer is none. It's just sort of a mess to get to.
Right.
That's really all it is.
Right. It's
defaced. And so I want you to think about that, and I want you to think about it as just ask the Lord to help you be conscious of value as we move forward for the next few weeks with all of the political upheaval and all the news media and all this kind of stuff, because this is a bigger issue than that, for sure. But I honestly believe if you'll keep this conscious and you'll just be saying, Lord, show me where I'm tempted to measure my value or another person's value, or a person that I hear a news story about, or somebody I'm tempted to make fun of, make me conscious of their genuine value independent of all these other variables. I believe he'll start to show us and help us.
Yeah.
So.
And if I can quickly read a couple of verses from Hebrews 2. Since the children, meaning humans, since the children really of God have flesh and blood, he, meaning Jesus, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. For surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. For this reason he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God. So you can't have worthlessness if, to be fully human, Jesus was made fully human. And he abolished the slavery of the fear of death, and really the slavery of the fear of worthlessness. Yep. Oh yeah, number. So it's 573 590 4638. So 573 590 4638. Anybody need it repeated again? Okay. So 573 590 4638. Stevens, Stephephens. I have a doctorate in clinical psychology and training in neuropsychology. No. So, paperback, hardcover, and an audio book is coming that will be read by our very own David Doherty.
All right, I love you guys, but I have to steal our board members for a 5-minute meeting. So if yeah, you know who you are. If you could come back there for 5 minutes. Anyway, if you're here and, okay, Dave's giving you the phone number. If you're here and you need the link to that book and you didn't get our text, in other words, that one I just sent out, don't leave. This literally will take 5 minutes or less, and I'll be here to get that link to you. And if you want to stay up with what we do in Joyland, there's a thing out there that shows you how to get a part of that text. And for those of you that visited tonight, thank you guys so much for coming.